satisfy their junk food cravings with some interesting cuisine.
Back in the 19th century, breakfast was often about survival, using every part of an animal and leftover scraps. From boiled pig's feet to lung hash, meals were more practical than appetizing. Let's explore. Number 25. Pickled Fish Surprise. Pickled fish may seem like an unusual breakfast today, but 200 years ago, it was a common dish among coastal communities and lower-income families who had access to preserved fish. Pickling was a popular method of preservation, allowing fish to last for months, if not years, when fresh supplies were scarce. The process involved curing fish, such as herring or mackerel, in a salt brine mix with vinegar and spices. The pungent, salty flavor of pickled fish provided a stark contrast to the otherwise bland breakfasts of the time. Like gruel or bread. For breakfast, pickled fish might be served cold alongside stale bread or boiled potatoes, offering a quick, high-protein meal to start the day. While the dish lacked the refinement of the fricassees enjoyed by wealthier households, it was filling and provided essential nutrients. The sharp taste of vinegar masked any off flavors from the fish's preservation, making it more palatable. In many homes, pickled fish became a go-to breakfast when fresh meats were unavailable. This dish, like many from the era, was born out of necessity and remains a testament to the ingenuity of 19th century home cooks in making the most of limited resources. Number 24. The Morning Offal Pie. In the 19th century, nothing went to waste in a poor household, especially when it came to food. Offal, or the internal organs or entrails of animals, was often the cheapest and most accessible form of protein.
First, preheat your oven up to 390 Fahrenheit degrees or 200 Celsius degrees.
Thus, the morning offal pie was born, combining leftover offal with potatoes, onions, and sometimes a bit of flour to create a hearty, if somewhat unusual, breakfast dish. Similar to the fricassees made by wealthier Virginian families, this pie was cooked slowly to tenderize the tough offal, although the ingredients were far less refined. The filling was simmered until the flavors melded together, then poured into a simple pie crust made from flour and lard. The pie was often baked in a communal oven, as many homes didn't have the luxury of their own baking equipment. The final product was a savory, filling pie that could feed an entire family for a fraction of the cost of meat. Offal pies varied from region to region, with some families adding spices or leftover vegetables to stretch the filling. While it was not a glamorous dish, morning offal pie was a reliable, warming breakfast that made use of every part of the animal, ensuring nothing was wasted. Number 23. Cold Porridge Delight. Cold porridge might sound less than appetizing today, but for many families 200 years ago, it was a practical and filling breakfast choice. After making a large pot of porridge or gruel in the evening, leftovers were often stored overnight and eaten cold the next morning. Similar to the corn mush and hominy eaten by early Virginian settlers, porridge was made from oats, barley, or cornmeal and cooked until thick and hearty. The cold version was sometimes sweetened with molasses or honey, or served with milk to make it more palatable. For poorer families, this breakfast saved on fuel, as it required no additional cooking in the morning. Though it lacked the warmth of freshly cooked porridge, cold porridge still provided the same level of sustenance and was surprisingly filling.
This is my third 100% hydration recipe. The first one was made with white flour. The second one was whole wheat.
Wealthier families, on the other hand, might reheat their porridge and serve it with more decadent ingredients like cream or fresh fruit. For the poor, however, cold porridge was a way to avoid waste while stretching out ingredients for as long as possible. Though it lacked flair, it was a reliable source of energy, much like the gruel of early colonial days. Number 22. Bone Broth Stew Bowl. Bone broth has made a modern comeback as a health food, but 200 years ago, it was an essential part of poor families' diets, especially for breakfast. The broth was made by simmering animal bones, often left over from the previous night's dinner, for hours, sometimes overnight, to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition. The result was a rich, gelatinous broth that could be served on its own or with added vegetables and grain. Much like the soups made by Virginian settlers, this dish was simple yet nourishing, providing essential minerals and collagen. Bone broth was often eaten with bread, making it a filling and warming breakfast, especially in colder months. For the poorest families, bone broth was sometimes all they had, and bones were often reused multiple times to stretch the meal. The broth's versatility made it a staple in many homes, as it could be adapted with whatever ingredients were available. Some families added root vegetables like carrots or turnips, while others mixed in grains like barley or rice for extra sustenance. While not a luxurious dish, Bone Broth Stew Bowl was a testament to the resourcefulness of early American households, making the most of every scrap of food. Number 21. Eel and hardtack mash. Eel was once a common food for those living near rivers and coastal areas, especially in Europe and North America. For poor families, eel was an inexpensive source of protein, and combined with hardtack, a type of dense, long-lasting bread made from flour, water, and salt, it became a practical, if unappetizing, breakfast.
The first step to making jellied eels is to clean the fish, take the guts out, and cut the eels into portions.
These are the eels.
The eel was typically stewed or fried, often with whatever herbs or spices were available. Meanwhile, hardtack, being notoriously tough, was softened by soaking it in water or milk, then mashed together with the eel to create a substantial, savory dish. This combination might seem strange today, but it was a way to make use of cheap, available ingredients. Like the Virginian settlers who relied on corn, porridge, and mush, the working class had to make do with what was available, and eel was one of the most accessible forms of meat. Hardtack, though lacking in flavor, provided much-needed calories and could last for months if stored properly. The dish wasn't glamorous, and its texture left much to be desired, but for many families 200 years ago, eel and hardtack mash was a nutritious, filling breakfast that made use of what the land and sea could offer. Number 20. Cornmeal mush pancakes. Cornmeal mush, much like gruel, was a staple of the poor, but with a twist. It could be turned into a slightly more exciting breakfast. Cornmeal mush pancakes. Cornmeal was boiled in water or milk until thick, then left to cool. The next morning, the mush was sliced into rounds and fried in lard or butter, turning the humble mush into crisp, golden pancakes. This dish was reminiscent of the fried cornmeal porridge or mush enjoyed by early settlers, though it was considered more of a luxury by poorer households. The crispy exterior contrasted with the soft, creamy interior, making it a more enjoyable meal than the typical bland mush or gruel. For those who could afford it, molasses or honey might be drizzled over the pancakes for added sweetness. The frying process added a richness and texture that elevated this simple dish into something heartier and more satisfying. Cornmeal mush pancakes were often served alongside salted meats or eggs if available.
10-cent meal, and Grandpa and I are eating for 20 cents. So if you have a large family, this is
But even on their own, they provided a filling, warming breakfast for those with limited means. They were an example of how 19th century families could take basic ingredients and transform them into more varied, appealing meals. Number 19. Blood pudding patties. Blood pudding, made from animal blood mixed with fat and grains, was a common breakfast food for poorer families in the 19th century. Blood, a byproduct of butchering, was cheap and abundant, making it an accessible ingredient for those who couldn't afford more expensive cuts of meat. Blood pudding patties were created by combining the blood with oatmeal or barley, then frying the mixture in lard to create crispy patties. Much like the fried liver and onion patties eaten by Virginian settlers, these patties were rich in flavor and provided essential nutrients such as iron and protein. While the taste of blood pudding might be considered strong or off-putting by modern standards,
while you try and figure out which dingy nightclub you lost your phone and wallet in is traditional,
it was a necessary part of the diet for many families 200 years ago. The patties were often served alongside bread or potatoes, adding bulk to the meal and making it more filling. For wealthier families, blood pudding might have been seasoned with herbs or spices, but for the poor, it was a simple, no-frill dish that provided sustenance. Blood pudding patties were not a delicacy, but they played an important role in providing nutrition to those who had limited options. Number 18. Salted beef scramble. Salted beef was a key source of protein for families who couldn't afford fresh meat. Breakfasts often included a salted beef scramble, a dish made by soaking salted beef overnight to remove excess salt, then scrambling it with eggs or leftover vegetables. This dish, much like the boiled salt pork cakes eaten in early American households, was designed to stretch out the meat supply while still offering a filling, flavorful meal. Eggs were a common addition if the family kept chickens, though for many, the beef was scrambled on its own with onions or potatoes. Salted beef was tough and required soaking or boiling before it could be cooked, but once prepared, it added a savory richness to the meal. The scramble was usually fried in lard or butter, giving it a crispy exterior while keeping the inside tender and flavorful. For wealthier families, spices and herbs might be added to enhance the flavor, but for the poor, it was a simple and hearty dish that provided essential calories and protein. Salted beef scramble was a practical and nourishing breakfast that allowed families to make the most of their limited resources, turning basic ingredients into a savory meal. Number 17. Lard spread with stale bread. In the 19th century, even the simplest of breakfast had to be filling and practical. One of the most basic meals was lard spread with stale bread, a no-cook option that was common among the poorest families. Lard, rendered animal fat, was spread onto slices of stale bread to provide a source of fat and calories. Much like the fried dishes popular among early settlers, this meal was all about utilizing every available resource. Bread that had gone hard was softened by dipping it in broth or water, and the lard, though tasteless compared to butter, provided essential energy. For wealthier families, butter or cream might have been used, but lard was a cheaper, more accessible alternative for those who couldn't afford dairy products. Sometimes a sprinkle of salt or sugar was added to the lard for a touch of flavor, though even that was a luxury. While it was not a glamorous meal, it was quick, cheap, and could be eaten on the go.
Then you can slice it and enjoy this lovely warm breakfast casserole.
In many ways, lard spread with stale bread was a reflection of the resourcefulness required to survive in a time when food was often scarce and nothing could be wasted. Number 16. The Tripe Soup Special. Tripe, the stomach lining of cows or pigs, was another common ingredient in 19th century breakfasts, especially for poor families. Tripe Soup Special was a hearty and affordable meal made by slowly simmering tripe with vegetables like onions, carrots, and potatoes. Much like the offal pies made by early settlers, tripe soup made use of parts of the animal that wealthier families might have discarded. The soup was rich in flavor and nutrients, as the long cooking process broke down the tough tripe, making it tender and palatable. Tripe was high in protein and other essential nutrients, making it a valuable addition to the diets of those who couldn't afford more expensive cuts of meat. The soup was often served with bread, which helped to stretch the meal and make it more filling. While the flavor of the tripe might have been an acquired taste, it was a versatile ingredient that could be used in various dishes. The Tripe Soup Special was a warming, nutritious breakfast that provided a much-needed boost of energy, particularly during the colder months when other fresh ingredients were scarce. Number 15. Black Pudding Fry-Up. Black pudding, a type of blood sausage, was a common breakfast dish for those who could not afford fresh meat. Made from congealed animal blood mixed with oats or barley, black pudding was sliced and fried in animal fat until crispy. Though rich in iron and protein, the intense flavor and gritty texture were far from appealing. It was often served with bread or potatoes to add bulk to the meal. For poor families, black pudding was a way to use every part of the animal.
So fry it for a couple of minutes on each side, and now behold the blackness of the pudding.
And its strong flavor helped mask the fact that the meal was made from blood. Despite its unpleasant taste for many, black pudding was a filling and nutritious breakfast. Number 14. Head Cheese Toast. Head cheese wasn't cheese at all, but a gelatinous meat product made from the head of a pig or cow, boiled until the meat fell off the bone. The meat was then mixed with spices and left to set into a jelly-like form. In the morning, slices of head cheese were placed on toasted stale bread or hardtack. The texture of the jelly combined with the toughness of the toast made for a breakfast that was more functional than flavorful. While unappealing, it was a way to use parts of the animal that wealthier families discarded. Ensuring that nothing went to waste. Number 13. Souse of pork. Souse was another dish made from the leftover parts of a pig, such as feet, snout, or ears, pickled in vinegar and spices. For breakfast, souse was often served cold alongside leftover boiled potatoes from the various day's meal. The tartness of the pickled meat contrasted with the blandness of the potatoes, but the dish was not for the faint-hearted. The texture was chewy, and the vinegar-heavy flavor could be overwhelming. However, for poor families, souse was a way to make sure every bit of food was used, and it provided a sour, tangy start to the day. Number 12. Fried cow brains on toast. For those who had access to fresh offal, cow brains were often turned into a breakfast dish. The brains were seasoned, dredged in flour, and fried until crispy, then served on toast. The creamy texture of the brains combined with the crunch of the toast created an unusual, slightly unsettling dish. While high in protein and fat, cow brains had a distinct, gamey flavor that many found off-putting. Still, for the working class, this was a practical way to use every part of the animal and start the day with a filling meal. Number 11. Cold tallow spread with bread. Tallow, or rendered beef fat, was a common byproduct of meat preparation, often used for cooking or as a spread. In poor households, cold tallow was sometimes spread on slices of stale bread for breakfast. While tallow was tasteless and greasy, It provided much-needed calories and energy for families who could not afford butter or other fats. The meal was heavy and unappetizing, but it served its purpose of providing sustenance.
Once you don't feel the salt scraping against the bottom of the bowl anymore, add the whole wheat flour. And again, we need to mix well.
It was often eaten quickly with a gulp of water to wash down the greasiness. Number 10. Sheep's head broth. In the 19th century, nothing went to waste, especially in poorer households. One of the most economical breakfast dishes was sheep's head broth. After the sheep's head was boiled for hours to extract every bit of flavor and nutrition, the broth was served with stale bread or boiled grains like barley. The dish wasn't just about the broth. The meat from the head, including the cheeks and tongue, was often shredded and mixed into the soup. While the broth was rich and hearty, the sight of the boiled sheep's head bobbling in the pot could be quite unappetizing for those not accustomed to it. The texture of the meat was tender but greasy, and the flavor was quite gamey, which wasn't to everyone's liking. However, for poor families, this was a nutritious and filling breakfast that used every part of the animal. The head could often be boiled multiple times, ensuring that the family got several meals out of it. While it might seem grotesque by today's standards, sheep's head broth was a practical and thrifty meal embodying the ethos of 19th century cooking, where nothing was wasted and every bit of sustenance was squeezed from the ingredients. Number 9. Chopped kidneys and onions. Kidneys, often overlooked today, was a breakfast staple for working-class families 200 years ago. Inexpensive and widely available, they were an essential source of protein for those who couldn't afford higher-quality meats. Kidneys were chopped finely and sautéed with onions in a large skillet, usually in leftover animal fat or lard. The dish had a strong, earthy taste, which could be quite polarizing, and the texture was often chewy. Kidneys were prized not just for their affordability, but also for their nutrient content. Being high in iron and vitamins, the onions helped to mask the strong flavors, adding a bit of sweetness to the meal. For many families, this dish was a welcome break from the usual porridge or bread. Some might even add leftover potatoes or bits of bread to make the meal more substantial. Though far from luxurious, chopped kidneys and onions were a warming, hearty breakfast, providing the necessary calories and sustenance for a long day of labor. Wealthier families might have enjoyed fancier cuts of meat, but for the poor, this dish was a flavorful and practical way to stretch their resources. Number 8. Boiled pig's feet. Yay! Pig's feet, also known as trotters, were a popular breakfast dish in many parts of the world 200 years ago, especially in rural areas where pigs were commonly kept. Boiling the feet for hours softened the tough, gelatinous meat, making it tender enough to eat.
I always clean my meat, even if it's just rubbing it down with a little bit of salt and water. So I have my pig's feet.
The resulting dish had a chewy, fatty texture, which could be difficult for some to stomach, but for many, it was a filling and affordable way to start the day. The broth from boiling the trotters was often saved to make soup or stew later in the week, ensuring that no part of the pig was wasted. The feet were sometimes pickled or fried after boiling, adding a bit more flavor, but in most cases they were simply eaten with bread or boiled potatoes. This dish was rich in collagen and fat, providing essential nutrients, but it was not considered particularly appetizing. For many poor families, however, boiling pig's feet were a reliable and nutritious breakfast, especially during leaner times when meat was scarce. The dish was a testament to the resourcefulness of 19th century cooking, where every part of the animal was used to feed the family. Number 7. fried ox tongue. Ox tongue, a cheap and nutritious cut of meat, was a common breakfast dish for poor families. The tongue was first boiled for several hours to tenderize it and remove the tough outer layer of skin. Once boiled, the tongue was sliced and fried in animal fat or lard until crispy. While the texture was tender, the flavor of ox tongue was quite strong, often described as gamey or beefy. Despite its distinct taste, it was a prized dish for those who couldn't afford more expensive cuts of meat. For breakfast, it was often served with fried bread or porridge, making it a hearty and filling meal. In some households, ox tongue was reserved for special occasions, as it provided a relatively large portion of meat compared to smaller organ meats like liver or kidneys. Though it wasn't a glamorous dish, fried ox tongue was a practical way to make use of every part of the animal, reflecting the frugality of the time. For families who had to stretch their food supplies, ox tongue provided an excellent source of protein and nutrients, making it a valuable part of the diet. Number 6. Boiled blood soup. Boiled blood soup, often made in rural or poorer households, was a breakfast dish that might turn modern stomachs, but 200 years ago, it was a nutritious and economical meal. Fresh animal blood, usually from a pig or cow, was collected during butchering and boiled with onions, vinegar, and grains like barley or oats. The result was a thick, iron-rich soup with a gelatinous texture. The vinegar helped to cut through the metallic taste of the blood, while the onions added some sweetness. Though the idea of consuming blood for breakfast might be off-putting, it was a valuable source of protein, especially for families who couldn't afford fresh meat regularly. In some cultures, the dish was considered a delicacy, but for most, it was a practical way to use every part of the animal. The soup was filling and warming, perfect for colder months when other ingredients were scarce. Despite its nutritional benefits, the flavor and texture of boiled blood soup weren't universally loved, and it was often seasoned heavily to make it more palatable. Nonetheless, it was a staple in many households, particularly in rural areas where meat was a luxury. Number 5. Lung and oatmeal hash. In the 19th century, lung was a common breakfast ingredient, especially in poorer households that made use of every part of the animal. Lung and oatmeal hash was a dish that combined chopped liver with oatmeal or barley to create a substantial, filling breakfast. The lung was first boiled to soften its spongy texture, then chopped into small pieces and mixed with cooked oatmeal or grains. The mixture was then fried in lard or leftover animal fat until crispy. Though the dish was hearty and provided essential nutrients, the texture of the lung could be off-putting to those not used to eating organ meats. The flavor was mild compared to other offal, but the chewy consistency made it less popular among wealthier families. For the working class, however, lung and oatmeal hash was a practical meal, providing a good balance of protein and carbohydrates. It was often served with a fried egg or some bread to make it more filling. Despite its lack of refinement, this dish was a staple in many households, offering a way to stretch resources and use parts of the animal that might otherwise go to waste. Number 4. Clabber milk with bread. Clabber milk, or soured milk, was a common breakfast food 200 years ago, especially in rural areas where fresh milk wasn't always available. When milk soured, it thickened and developed a tangy, yogurt-like flavor. Instead of throwing it away, families used to create a simple breakfast by pairing it with bread or cornmeal. Clabber milk was often eaten cold, straight from the crock and mixed with stale bread to make a hearty, if somewhat sour, meal. Some families would sweeten the clabber milk with molasses or honey if they could afford it, but for many, it was eaten plain. The tangy flavor could be an acquired taste, and the thick texture made it feel more substantial than plain milk. For poorer families, clabber milk was an easy way to use up spoiled milk without waste, and it provided a good source of calcium and probiotics. While the dish wasn't glamorous, it was practical, filling, and inexpensive, making it a staple in many households. Despite its humble origins, clabber milk with bread helped many families get through lean times, especially when fresh dairy was scarce. Number 3. Fried crackling cakes. Crackling, the crispy bits left over from rendering pork fat, were a prized ingredient in many poor households, and they were often turned into fried crackling cakes for breakfast. Cracklings were mixed with cornmeal or flour to create a batter, then fried in more fat until golden and crisp. These cakes were crunchy and greasy, with a strong pork flavor, providing a high-calorie meal that could sustain families through a long day of work. The cracklings themselves were a byproduct of lard production, meaning they were virtually free for those who could afford to render their own fat. The cakes were sometimes served with molasses or syrup to add a bit of sweetness, though more often they were eaten plain. For families who couldn't afford fresh meat, crackling cakes were a way to get the taste of pork without the cost. While the dish was far from refined, it was practical and filling, and the crispy texture made it a bit more exciting than the usual porridge or bread. Fried crackling cakes were a common breakfast in rural areas where families made use of every part of the pig. Number 2. Boiled tripe with potatoes. Tripe, the stomach lining of cows or sheep, was a staple in many households that couldn't afford better cuts of meat. Boiled tripe with potatoes was a popular breakfast dish in the 19th century, particularly in rural areas. The tripe was boiled for several hours to tenderize its tough, chewy texture, then served alongside boiled potatoes. The dish was bland but filling, providing a decent amount of protein and carbohydrates. For those who could afford it, onions, vinegar, or herbs were added to improve the flavor, but most families ate it plain. Tripe was high in collagen and other nutrients, making it a valuable food source for poorer households. The texture of tripe, however, was not universally loved, and the dish's mild flavor often left much to be desired. Despite its shortcomings, boiled tripe with potatoes was a practical meal that made use of inexpensive, available ingredients. The dish was often served as breakfast because it was hearty enough to keep workers full throughout the day, and the potatoes helped stretch the meal further, ensuring that large families could eat on a limited budget. Number 1. Cold potato and lard sandwich. For many poor families, leftovers from dinner often became the next day's breakfast, and cold potato and lard sandwiches were a prime example of this. Leftover boiled potatoes were sliced and placed between 2 pieces of stale bread that had been spread with lard. The sandwich was hearty and greasy, but it provided much-needed calories and fat for families who couldn't afford more luxurious ingredients like butter or fresh meat. Lard, being cheaper and more available than butter, was a staple in many households, and it was often spread on bread to make it more palatable. The potatoes, though bland, added bulk to the sandwich, making it a filling meal that could sustain workers through a long day of labor. Though the sandwich was far from appetizing, it was practical and inexpensive, and it made use of ingredients that might otherwise go to waste. Cold potato and lard sandwiches were a common breakfast in rural areas and among the working class, where every meal had to stretch as far as possible. Despite its simplicity, the sandwich provided essential nutrients and kept hunger at bay. These were the brutal breakfasts people ate 200 years ago. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the like button.